Well, thank you very much, Gene. Good morning, everybody. I appreciate that recitation of my life, but you left out one important thing about my congressional career, and it relates directly to what I'm going to talk about. I am the founder and co-chair of the Congressional Bourbon Caucus. And I will say it is one of the most popular and civil and bipartisan caucuses in Congress. And our events are very well attended and, as you might expect, very spirited, no pun intended. I will talk about that a little bit more in a while. You know, some people, I was asked to address the issue of civility in government, and I am going to do that, and hopefully we'll morph into discussion of leadership, and then I'll certainly want to respond to your questions and listen to what's on your mind as well. But when you talk about civility in government, I think of when you look on your rearview mirror in the car, objects in this mirror are closer than they may appear. Actually, Congress is a lot more civil than it may appear. And I'm going to give you some examples of that, but then I'm going to also tell you why the problem with the public perception of the lack of civility in Congress is a real problem, and it's killing democracy, and so I want to go into that as well. But last year, I was one of the so-called Gang of Eight in the House that worked on immigration reform. And 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans. Of the 4 Republicans, I don't think I had ever said 10 words to any of them. But here we sat for 2 or 3 hours every day we were in session for 6 months. And at the end of the period, I'm going to skip to the end and then retrace. At the end of that session, John Carter, who's a member from Texas, Republican from Texas, said, it was just the 8 of us in the room then, and he said, you know, guys, there was one woman, but he said, you know, guys, I have to tell you that this is the first time, I've been in Congress for 12 years, this is the first time I've ever felt that there were Democrats I could call friends and trust. And I said, that's really nice of you to say, John, but it's also terribly sad. I don't think that's representative of how most of us operate. I have several good friends among Republicans and a lot of casual friends. And there's very little incivility in our day-to-day lives. We don't avoid each other. We don't sneer at each other. We don't yell at each other privately. We actually get along really well. I have 2 good friends, Trey Gowdy and Mick Mulvaney, both from South Carolina, both as conservative as it is possible to be, I think. They and I will never vote alike on any issue. I will guarantee you that. And we're good friends. And Trey Gowdy and I consider Trey one of the people I trust most in Congress and whose integrity I respect most in Congress. And it kind of gets crazy, and this is part of my message. We were on Geraldo Rivera's radio show one day together. Of course, we're not in the same room. We're doing it on the phone. And so Geraldo likes to bring Republicans and Democrats together so they'll have a food fight, which is what most media want to do. They thrive on conflict and portraying conflict. So I know that Geraldo's producer thought that Trey Gowdy and I were going to have a real good blowout. So Geraldo introduces Trey, and Trey says, Geraldo, it's good to be with you, and it's good to be with my good friend John Yarmuth, who is one of the nicest people on the face of the earth. And I said, you know, back at you, Trey. And I know Geraldo's thinking, who in the hell booked these 2? And we had the most polite, civil, thoughtful, deferential discussion of some contentious issues that you could possibly have. Well, suffice to say, he and I have never been asked to get back on the show together. But that's really what relationships are like on Capitol Hill. It is really much better than it appears. We had, as Gene said, I'm on the budget committee, and we have this year, and back in April, what we have every year, which is the markup of the budget. So the Republicans, they're in the majority. They propose their budget. This is what is known as the Paul Ryan budget. And then we spend a day offering amendments to it. And it's largely a rhetorical exercise because they vote down all of our amendments, and we're basically just offering amendments to try and force them to cast embarrassing votes. But it goes on for a long time. It starts at 10 o'clock in the morning, goes till 9 or 10 at night. So about 5 o'clock, it was getting kind of tedious, and I said to my staffer, I'm going downstairs and bring some bourbon back up here because this is too much. So we have a hearing room where we do our public business, and then there's an ante room where they bring in food during the day and refreshments, so because we're there again for 10 hours or so. So I brought the bourbon up, put it out on the table, invited some of the Republicans and our people. I said, hey, I've got some bourbon back here if you want. Well, all of a sudden, people start leaving the hearing room, streaming into the back room, and taking a cup and having a little bourbon. And again, it was very bipartisan. And at the end of the night, I ended up back with two Republicans at one of their apartments. They said, come on back and have some more bourbon. I got this special thing back in my apartment, so I did that. But anyway, it was during the last few hours were so much more civil than the first 7 or 8. And at one point, Chris Van Hollen, who's our ranking member, so Paul Ryan sits in the chair, and then Chris, and then I sit next to Chris. And I've been saying to Chris I said, you want some? He said, no, not yet. I still have to do some things. And I said, well, yeah, I do too, but it usually helps me. And so finally he says, okay, get me a cup. So I go out and get a cup, bring it back. And Paul Ryan looks over at me and says, do I smell bourbon here? And I said, Paul, I'm surprised you know what it is, but I guarantee you, your Republican colleagues know what it is because they've been enjoying it. Unfortunately, bourbon is probably not going to be enough to bring us together. I wish it were, and that's what I want to talk about. Really, is why this perception of incivility is so damaging to us. First of all, I don't want to say like I am excusing either myself or my colleagues from making a better effort to work together. I'm going to blame a lot of the perception of incivility and intransigence on other factors. We do bear individual responsibility, so I want to make that clear from the outset. But I want to describe the world that we live in and try to operate in. And that, to me, is the biggest problem facing us right now. And I'm going to say this with full understanding that I am criticizing all of my former colleagues in the media, because I do believe the media are some of our biggest problems. First of all, let me say, in Washington, virtually everything we deal with is really complicated. There are no simple answers. Whether you're talking about health care, which is the absolute most complicated subject anybody ever tried to deal with, or education, or immigration, or energy policy. All of these things are really tough issues with a lot of nuances. The American people basically don't have the time or the energy, and in most cases the resources, to dive deep into these issues. And unfortunately, the media understand that. So they don't try to lead their audiences toward better understanding of an issue. What they do is try to create a prism through which every issue is perceived as a contest. And what I say, the way I describe it parochially is this is like U of L and UK. Okay? The media describe everything as you have to choose one side or the other. You have to be for health care reform or against it. You have to be for immigration reform or against it. Nothing in this world is like that. Nothing in your lives is like that. But that's the way it is portrayed. And when that's the way the public sees it, and that's the way we understand the public is getting it, we start playing that role. So we become essentially participants in a sporting event rather than policymakers trying to figure out solutions to very challenging problems. So what happens? In this world, if you're, oh, one other thing. 30 years ago, the average soundbite in television news was 43 seconds. Today it's 9.8. So I learned this lesson the hard way on healthcare reform. And because I was actually one of our 3 or 4 lead spokespeople when we were developing the Affordable Care Act. I did more than 100 national media appearances, most of them on Fox News. So I went into the teeth of the lion on that one. And I realized that you really can't say much about healthcare in 9.8 seconds. You can say death panels, you can say government takeover, you can say socialized medicine, but you can't give anybody a sense of what we were trying to do, how this would help their lives, what it would mean to them, how it worked. Obviously, you can't do that. You can take 9.8 days and maybe get it done, but certainly 9.8 seconds. So what do you do there? You become a bumper sticker. Basically, you become a personalized bumper sticker, or a human bumper sticker, maybe that's a better way to put it. And we throw these words out, catchphrases, talking points, as condensed as we can, and we don't help anybody understand the issues that we're talking about. So what do people do? They do what all of us would do. They default to their natural inclination. So they like Obama or they don't. So if he says something, they're for it or against it because he said it. I can go on probably for a half an hour and talk about all of the things that President Obama has done over the last 6 years that were Republican ideas that Republicans opposed because he said them. The list just goes on and on and on. It would be funny if it weren't so tragic. But the point of all this is that we have an outside world that is pushing us to be simplistic and to be contentious. And I don't like it. My immigration reform experience indicated to me in the clearest possible terms that a different approach is possible. Because we sat there every day and did what every normal, rational human being would do. We compromised, we horse traded, we said, well, what if we do it this way? Well, if we do it that way, then I lose this group and we're gonna have a hard time getting these votes. And well, what if we do it this way? Yeah, I might be able to sell that. That's how the conversations went, day after day after day. And the only reason we were able to do that was because we did it in secret. Because if we had been doing it in public, there would have been, every time one of us deviated from either on our side, MoveOn.org, or Rachel Maddow, whatever it is, or they diverted from Rush Limbaugh, or Club for Growth, or whatever it is, then the advocacy industry would have been down our throats, on our cases, and we would have had thousands and thousands of angry emails saying, how can you sell out like this, blah, blah, blah. You all know how it goes. But that's the world that we're trying to function in. And I hate to say it as a media person who believes totally in transparency and openness, that openness is killing Congress. It is really impeding our ability to do anything. So we have a huge challenge in this country in trying to figure out how to have thoughtful discussions about very complicated, serious topics. And we don't know how to do that right now. And it is really, really impeding our country. Let me give you a sense of one other thing about how polarized we are. As Gene said, I was a staffer back in the 70s for a Republican senator from Kentucky, Marlo Cook. And back then, some of you are old enough to remember these names, in the Republican Party, we had our conservatives, Jesse Helms, Barry Goldwater, Strom Thurmond, but we also had extreme liberal members, Mark Hatfield from Oregon, Jacob Javits from New York, Ed Brooke from Massachusetts. We had the entire spectrum, philosophical spectrum, in one party. On the other side, Democrats had Ted Kennedy and Hubert Humphrey and Fritz Mondale, liberals, but they also had James Sparkman from Alabama, Russell Long from Louisiana, John Stennis from Mississippi, people who in today's world would be as conservative as any of the Tea Party people. So again, both parties had the entire range of thinking. So you were always working across the aisle with somebody else, because there was always somebody on the other side that agreed with you. That is not the world of Congress right now. And the best way I know to explain it graphically is to talk about the National Journal rankings. So every year, National Journal is a magazine that covers the federal government. And every year, they take the voting records of all members of Congress for the previous year, and they rank everybody as to how liberal or conservative they were. So like my first year, I was the 140th most liberal member of Congress. Last year, by the way, I was 49th. I haven't changed that much, but that's kind of the point. Anyway, they rank everybody, and then they do a visual. They do 435 lines, each line representing a House member, and Republicans are in red and Democrats are in blue, and they just spread them across a page. Well, if you had looked at that graph for the voting year 2010, which was the year before the Republican takeover of the House, there would have been 75 or 80 overlapping lines, red and blue in the middle. If you looked at last year, for 2013, there were 3. That's it. So essentially there was one Democrat who was more conservative than 2 Republicans were liberal, and vice versa. So we don't just have kind of a difference of opinion. This is Mars and Venus. And we're now having debates in Congress that we've never had before. And the debates now are, like we used to debate, even my first couple years on the Budget Committee, when we were talking about higher education funding, it was, do we spend this much or do we spend this much? You know, just a debate over amounts. Now we're having a debate, we want to spend this much, they want to kill the Department of Education. So these are fundamental questions now that are being raised, and the differences are dramatic. Same way with the environment. You know, at one time it was, you know, subtleties about EPA, what they should be doing, and how much they should be spending on what. And now it's there is no such thing as climate change. So let's just do away with the EPA. That's the debate we're having. Well, obviously, when you have people like John Boehner and Eric Cantor, and I'm not being partisan here, because I'm just going to quote them, who say, well, what we need to be doing is finding common ground and acting in areas we have common ground. That makes sense, except there is no common ground. So as a consequence, we're not a legislative body right now. We are a debating society. And we are debating very important questions. They're the same questions that we've been debating for 230 years in this country. What's the proper role of the federal government? Where should we be involved and where not, and to what extent? Those are important questions. But meanwhile, there are things going on in this country that need attention. And only Congress can do it. The 2 most prominent ones I can think of are immigration reform. There is nothing that anybody can do except the federal government, despite some efforts of state legislators to defy the Constitution in that regard. But and then infrastructure spending, which always was a bipartisan initiative and now has become a philosophical or ideological debate. So I don't want to cast a dark cloud over this session, and I would love to leave you with a more optimistic prognosis of what Congress can do and will do. Unfortunately, I can't. And ultimately, it's up to citizens to demand better. And you know, hopefully, maybe the Eric Cantor defeat earlier this week will wake people up to the fact that no matter how powerful you may think you are, the voters have the ultimate say as to whether you're doing your job or not. And we have a race in Kentucky, as I'm sure you all know, for the United States Senate this year. And the reason Mitch McConnell is in very serious trouble in Kentucky is the same reason that Eric Kander lost, because people perceive them as being the face of a dysfunctional Congress, and they're not happy with that. So ultimately, again, you can't do anything in politics or in government without public support, and hopefully the public will rise up and say, you need to do better. Whether you are really civil or not, you need to act civilly, and you need to act in our interest and not just in your personal interest. So that's kind of my perspective on what's going on. We do need leaders in Congress. I'm very concerned that, and I will say this of both parties in Congress, our leaders are much more concerned with electoral dynamics than they are with policy dynamics. Leadership does have an effect on how we act day to day. And when I was a staffer, of course, campaigns were very different then. They didn't last nearly as long. They were 3 months long at the most. But there was a very definite shift that you ran your campaign, you were in election mode, campaign's over, and then you switched into governing mode. The mentality was totally different. Now there is no governing mentality. It is all electoral. So everything that is done, and I generalize maybe a little bit, but I think it is almost universally true, that virtually everything we do is done with an electoral purpose and not a policy purpose or a governing purpose. Again, the American people are going to have to demand that we change. And I hope that we get leaders who understand that. Again, I think Eric understands it now a little bit too late. And I hope that will be a good outcome of that race if it wakes everybody up. So I'll close with that and be happy to answer any questions you have. And I just so I don't forget to do it later, thank you all for what you do. This is really important because regardless of at what level of society you are, leadership is incredibly important. You're role models in that regard, and many of you in the higher education world, thank you for doing what you do and spending your lives in higher education, because that's one of the critical things that will get us past this malaise we're in right now. So thanks, and let me take your questions. Yes,
Yes. I have really a two-part question because now I'm kind of depressed.
Sorry about that.
I always hear at election time that your vote counts, but now I'm thinking, what can one person do as a voter? I mean, obviously I can go to the polls and say yes or no, but how can I, as a person now, be more informed and not get maybe totally down in the weeds of Congress, but how can I get below the sound bites and at least become a little more informed for myself?
Yeah, well, if I ever were to go into teaching, having been in the media and now in politics, the course I would like to teach is news consumption. To teach how people should consume news and what they should be on the lookout for. There are no easy answers to that. It's a good news, bad news situation. The good news is that there is more information available to people today than there ever has been in history. When I was growing up in Louisville, there were 2 TV stations. We didn't even have an ABC affiliate when I was growing up. So we had CBS and NBC. We had a couple radio stations that did news, and we had 2 newspapers that were owned by the same company. That was it. So everybody started from the same basis of information, foundation of information. It sometimes was wrong, like Vietnam was wrong, but at least we all started from the same point. Today, there are so many opportunities to be informed and misinformed that's one of the biggest problems we have in forming any kind of consensus. Because again, if you're in the Fox News, Wall Street Journal editorial page, Rush Limbaugh silo, and you're talking to somebody who's in the MSNBC, New York Times, Rachel Maddow's silo, there's no way you can ever form an agreement because you start off from such a different perspective. One of the things that I believe is another problem here is that, and this relates to your question, is that over the past 30 years or so, there has been a steady and intentional plan executed brilliantly by conservative institutions in this country to try and discredit media. And the reason they've done that is because if you can discredit legitimate media, then you can say anything. And it has as much credibility as something you might read in the New York Times. And so credibility has no market value anymore. And you look around and say, who do you trust? Nobody trusts anybody. It's politicians, media, religious leaders, sports figures. Nobody has any credibility. So when there's no market value in credibility, anything is equally credible. And I can't tell you how many times I get emails from people saying, how can you look at yourself in the mirror when this is going on? And I look at what they're showing me or sent me, and it's something that is not vetted by anybody. It's just something that was made up. And so I can't tell you how many people have said to me, I just don't know who to trust anymore, who to believe anymore. Tell me what's true. It's like people think that members of Congress can retire after being elected one time at full salary for life, that we don't pay into Social Security, that we get free health care, that we don't have to abide by the same laws that normal citizens do. All that's nonsense, but it's been in an email that's gone around the world about 100 times. I think we're at the nadir of that, and I think over the next 10 years, there's going to be some kind of value put on credibility, and that'll be a really good thing. And then you'll know what to read to get an honest and factual information. But right now, it's a real problem. Did you ask your second part? Or?
Well, I was just going to say, as a voter, we always hear, be sure you go and vote because your vote counts. And I realize that philosophically
It does.
but
It does. You ask, even, there's so many races that one of my best friends in Congress, Joe Courtney, who was elected with me back in 2006, he won by 92 votes out of several 100,000 cast. So, no, one vote matters.
thank you.
It does.
Yeah, John, the impact of big money is really controlling politics now, in my opinion, especially because you have to have big money to do target voter manipulation, which is occurring right now. I mean, most people in the country have no idea how elections are really being run. And if it takes so much money to do that, and right now there are a few people who are investing, I'm from Kansas, so we can talk about the coast, they're making major investments in controlling certain outcomes of elections, and they've been very good at it. So how do you overcome that?
Well, I actually I totally agree with you. I've been a staunch opponent of Citizens United. I've got a constitutional amendment that I've introduced to overturn Citizens United. I'm part of the election reform task force that is trying to pass disclose legislation, so everybody has to disclose who the donors to these things are. Campaign finance reform, public financing. I'm all for all of those things, and I think they're very important. The market's actually taken care of some of this, and I'll tell you why. Obviously, most of the money is needed for TV ads. Well, right now, 52% of all TV viewing is done on a recorded basis. And that's only going to get higher. So people are going to be spending a lot of money to reach fewer and fewer people.
That's not what they're doing with the money. They're sending out survey data. They're sending out surveys to people. And depending upon how you respond to that survey, they can personally take the message from that candidate and give it back to them so they believe that that candidate supports their opinion. So if anyone fills out a survey, they've got the technology to be able to package that candidate for that particular person.
And part of that's illegal.
That's not radio and TV. That's
Right.
a whole different kind of campaign.
Right, and part of that's illegal, because they can't be coordinating with campaigns. That's another problem we have, is that we have a Federal Election Commission that is basically, is not just incompetent, it doesn't function. They don't have any members, and they don't meet. And they're the body, and, I mean, they don't have enough members appointed to them to actually function. And so, and they're the ones supposedly enforcing our campaign finance laws. But there's nothing that we can do short of a constitutional amendment to limit the money, now that the Supreme Court's ruled. And so we have to deal with that the only way we can deal with it. It's horrible. No, I know. I'm just lucky that the Koch brothers haven't targeted me, because. Yes, sir.
Thank you first, Congressman, for your service and your longevity. Could you comment on the balance between spending time in your district and spending time in Washington?
Yeah, right now, the Republicans are in the majority, so they set the schedule, and we meet now essentially 3 days, every 1 week, 3 days the next week, and then we're out of session the third week. So we have 6 days of business out of every 21. That's how often we're there. This will blow your mind. Between now and Election Day, so 5.5 months from now, we are scheduled to be in session 36 days. And of the 36 days we're in session, 10 of those are the days we come back, so either Monday or Tuesday of a particular week, when we don't go into session until 6:30 at night. So they're really not business days. They count them as days in session, but we don't work. We go in and cast a few non-controversial votes. So we have 26 days of business in the next 5.5 months before the election's over. When we were in charge, we worked a lot more. I think we were in session maybe 160 to 65 days. They're in session this year 91 days total. But the Republicans don't have a real agenda. So, when we were in the majority, we had things we wanted to do, like it or hate them. We were working. We did the Affordable Care Act. We did Dodd-Frank. We did energy legislation. We did serious policy work, and we were there a lot and thought we had to be there a lot. Republicans don't want to do anything, so they think it's better to be in the district. Now, I say that partially with a sense of frustration, but also with a sensitivity or a sympathy for what they're doing. Because if we can't get anything done, one of the most important things we can do is be back in our districts, talking to our constituents, making them feel they have a connection to their government, and trying to inform them about issues that affect their lives. So, I know if we're not going to legislate, it's good that we're home. But to me, we've taken it to the extreme.
Thank you.
Hmm? You had a question in the back.
Yeah. You were talking about media. What are your thoughts about Al Jazeera America?
I've been on Al Jazeera America a few times. They have quality journalists. They do decent work. Their program quality is awful. And I mean, the visual, the last time I checked, they don't even have high definition stuff. So it's like watching old grainy news footage. It shows you when your eyes get accustomed to one thing, you try to do something else. It's awful. So I don't really see them as having much of a future unless they really make a lot of investment. But they do pretty good reporting, and they often do. They spend a lot of time on some things that other media don't. So in terms of getting a better picture of what's going on around the world, Al Jazeera does a pretty good job of that.
Yeah. Congressman, well, first of all, I appreciate your perspective, especially having talked through being in Washington from then till now. And I think some of the patterns you speak to are predictable, and leaders and people, they adapt and change over a period of time. One of the things that I think is not going to change is the shortness of the communication medium. As much as we, might like to go back to the 43-second and fully explain an issue, that time is passing. For those of us that work in other sectors, we face the same. Folks are just not going to listen to a complex idea until it's distilled down into something might not even be the right thing. So I don't think that goes away. But what I would really appreciate your perspective on, it seems that not just at the national congressional level, which I believe is a lightning rod for some of the dysfunction in the system, but there's 50 other legislatures that function in our country. And it seems that at least in some of those, people are able to, sit down, have the conversations that require good governing versus just electoral policy. Are there any lessons that we can take from what might be happening on the state level to say, okay, that's the experiment that's going to eventually help out?
I don't know what state are you in.
I live in Michigan.
You probably have one. Kentucky certainly doesn't have a functioning legislature. Kentucky actually has a Republican House and a Democratic House, Republican Senate. The Democratic House is the only Democratic-controlled legislative body going south until you get to Puerto Rico. So you have one-party rule through a huge segment of the country, and there are, in California, the legislature is 75-something% Democratic. I mean, they have veto-proof House and Senate. So it seems to me that we have an imbalance throughout the legislature. So, hopefully, maybe Michigan can be a model for the country if it's functioning effectively. Yeah.
Congressman, thank you for being here. So to that point, in terms of breaking through and changing the game, so to speak, in terms of the politics of the moment, you were speaking before a little bit about engagement with constituents at the times that you're not in D.C. And I was wondering if there are different approaches that you think can be used by leaders, not only in Congress, not only in the state legislatures, but by all types of community leaders, to better engage their constituents as we move forward. Because it sounds like, regardless of whether or not it's 9.8 seconds or 9.8 days, it still comes down to public support for a lot of these actions. So I was kind of curious to see what you thought about that.
Well, the essence of good politics and leadership is good communication skills. I think there are a lot of people involved in government that are not particularly good communicators, and there are people who are very good, sometimes too good. But if we could make everybody communicate effectively, then again we would help promote understanding. That's a very profound question that I'm not sure I can do anything except ramble on about. This has a lot to do with schools. It has a lot to do with teaching critical thinking, because the more we have a populace that is good at critical thinking, the more effective and the more honest politicians and leaders will have to be. So it's a long-term solution, just like the short-term, the media brevity. That's not going to change anytime soon. I don't think we're going to be able to create a critical thinking populace very soon either. Yeah.
Congressman, again, I said, well, thank you for your service and your time here with us. And of course, the first question was, that was asked about you, does my vote count? And of course it does. I'm from Florida, trust me. At the same time, you jokingly made fun of the congressional bourbon Congress. But obviously, there are some ways that you connect in there. So does those social opportunities create bonds to get things done? As now, have they been done before that they're not getting done now? Are folks just not talking in Congress?
No, people talk all the time. And talk very honestly. I will give you an example involves Trey Gowdy. Trey and I became friendly because we played golf. We have a golf event every year that the Republicans and Democrats play each other. We raise money for the First Tee programs, but it's a very competitive event. And Trey's their best golfer, and I'm our best golfer. And so we've played together several times, and we again, got to be friends and have mutual respect because of that. So we don't drink together because Trey doesn't drink, but but we were able to have conversations. And when we were doing immigration reform last year, Trey's the chairman of the immigration subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee. So Trey and I were talking constantly about, what we can do, because he wanted to be helpful, even though his chairman, Bob Goodlatte, also from Virginia, was not supporting it. So we were kind of plotting and seeing what we could do and how we might strategize. It hasn't worked out yet, but we had all those conversations. Pete Roscom, who is from Illinois, when I was on Ways and Means, Pete was the most junior Republican, I was the most junior Democrat, so we sat next to each other, the way they seated. And while the debates were going on, we'd say, well, what if we did that this way? Yeah, I think that'd be good. I said, and we say this to each other a lot, put us in a room for 15 minutes and we can figure this out. Just let us talk. So there are a lot of conversations going on about that. And what I think the problem is that they're not conversations at the highest levels. So when Nancy Pelosi and John Boehner, if they were having those conversations, that would be very good. But they don't have those conversations. Because again, Boehner's trying desperately to make sure they stay in the majority, so he's remains speaker. Nancy wants to become speaker again and wants us to be in the majority. We all want it. All the Democrats want to be in the majority. Being in the minority in the House really sucks. It's awful. I think it's because of that perspective that the leaders have, that the conversations that the rank and file members have don't go very far. But we have them all the time. Nobody's happy with the way Congress operates. And it became really clear during the government shutdown when we were wandering the halls, literally wandering the halls, because if our constituents came and they wanted tours of the Capitol, we had to take them because there were no employees to take them. So we had to take them. And we'd be looking at each other and say, what are we doing? And the Republicans were saying this to us, we don't know what we're doing. This makes no sense. So again, the rank and file would like to see a different world. It's finding a path to get that done that's the problem. All right, well, thanks for your questions. Thanks again for having me here today. I really enjoyed the session, and I wish you the best, and thanks again for your work promoting leadership in the country.